Hello, everyone. I am Thomas Christian Williams, an American author in France since 1989. And we're going to talk today, for about an hour or so about this book. You see here the title before you, Volney's Ruins of Empires. This book was once world famous, very popular in Europe, very popular in North America, in the United States. Really, it was pretty well known in a lot of different languages, all the way from the Ganges in the east to the Mississippi in the west back in that day. First published in France in French, 1791. Volney was then a member of the very first National Assembly. He was sitting on the committee that was writing the very first French Constitution. At the same time, he was working on the final touches, the final chapters of this book, Ruins of Empires, Les Ruines, Méditation sur les révolutions des empires. The interesting thing was, at this exact same moment in French history, Thomas Jefferson was there. He knew many of these deputies in this new French National Assembly. Jefferson was the American ambassador. He had just replaced Benjamin Franklin. In fact, it was Franklin who introduced Thomas Jefferson to Volney. Why? Because when Volney was younger, a university student in Paris, Benjamin Franklin had acted as his mentor and had suggested that he travel the world to broaden his horizons. We'll discuss that here in just a little bit. So this gives you an idea who Volney was. He was a philosopher and a politician and a world traveler. Everybody knew him. And he knew many people, and his works were well known worldwide. From the late 1700s, 1780s, 1790s, all the way up until about the 1920s. Volney was pretty well known among, let's call it, academic elite circles, politicians, people interested in women's rights and abolition of slavery and freedom for individuals and economics based upon the principles of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Yeah, Volney's Ruins of Empires encompasses all these things, and that was why it was popular. It was like a Bible for the age of enlightenment. That is, it was a go-to book. It was a book of values. It was a book of historical lessons. What causes empires to rise and fall? Is there not a single general principle that applies to all countries, all cultures, all continents, all centuries? And of course, yes, Volney says there is such a general principle. It applies to everybody, not just when he was writing in the late 18th century, but indeed this book, Volney's Ruins, applies to situations, problems faced by humanity today, and we're going to talk about that. But getting back to Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson was introduced to Volney by Benjamin Franklin, as I mentioned. They became kind of not so much friends, but colleagues. Volney and Jefferson were together one day in the new National Assembly, and they were under fire. The king's gendarmes had surrounded them and were firing muskets into the building where Jefferson was with a certain group of the most freedom-oriented, liberal French deputies, including Volney. And there was a chance of death or being wounded. Everybody in that building was under threat. And they could have very well been harmed, including Thomas Jefferson. And then all of a sudden, these King's soldiers, they left. Boom, they disappeared. They were shooting at everybody, firing into the building where the deputies were, and then all of a sudden, boom, they were gone. And it was right then that the news came down. The Bastille had fallen. So this gives you just a small idea of the times and the events that Volney and Jefferson shared. In the early days of the French Revolution, before things turned bad. Later, in the mid-1790s, Volney had left the National Assembly, he had left politics, and he traveled to the United States. He landed in Philadelphia, which was then the capital. John Adams was president. Thomas Jefferson was vice president. Volney visited Jefferson at Jefferson's house atop the hill, Monticello. He stayed there for 2 weeks at Jefferson's residence during the summer of 1796, and it was then that the two men conceived the conspiracy. Thomas Jefferson would anonymously translate Volney's Ruins of Empires. Why anonymously? Why translate the book at all? We're going to discuss these things, but this is all information that me, Thomas Christian Williams, a native of Texas, come to France as a student in 1989. Got a degree here, got a couple of jobs here, and then as I was doing research for my first historical fiction novel, English Turn, Napoleon Invades Louisiana, I came upon this issue of Thomas Jefferson's anonymous translation of Volney's Ruins, and I incorporated it into my book. So we're going to discuss that some too. The point being, almost by accident, I have become the world's leading expert on this issue, Thomas Jefferson's anonymous translation of Volney's Ruins, and why that is important today. So, here's the front cover of my first historical fiction novel, English Turn, in French, Detour Anglois. And we're going to talk about that later, where that title comes from, English Turn. Anyone who lives near New Orleans probably is familiar with that phrase, English Turn, less so the French origin, Detour Anglois. But here's the front cover. It's available on Amazon. English Turn, Thomas Christian Williams, just look that up. Volume 1, Ruins of Empires, Napoleon Invades Louisiana. That was why I was doing research. I was working at the time in a completely separate job. And a certain French politician provoked me to conceive of those three words, Napoleon Invades Louisiana. And it was then doing the research for that novel in the nighttime, I came upon this historical oddity, Thomas Jefferson's translation of Volney's Ruins, and I incorporated it into this book. So if you like my work, subscribe to this channel, give me a like, and if you would like to support my work and see more videos, I invite you to purchase my novels. This is my first novel, English Turn. It's available on Amazon. And here's my second. I just published this one last year, 2024. Kash, Kachu, White House. Volume 1, Revenge of the Kachina. This is a story about the collapse of the civilization that was located in modern-day Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Any of you, perhaps with a familiarity of the Four Corners region, you've heard of Chaco Canyon and the palaces that were constructed there. My story, Kash, Kachu, White House, comes from various legends circulating even among the tribes of the region today, saying that something bad happened at this mythical sky city called Kash, Kachu, which translates as White House. And my story, my novel, is based upon partly those legends still circulating today, those oral traditions among many of the local tribes, including the origin myth of Acoma, which is the oldest continuously inhabited city in what is now the United States. So let's move on. Here's our guy. This is Volney. This is the world's best portrait of Volney, and you will not find it in France. Nope. It's located in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. You can see it online, pafa.org. Good-looking guy, intelligent-looking guy. He's got his hands on the books there. Learned, world traveler, well-fed, healthy. Yeah, that was him. That was a portrait made during his stay in the United States, mostly in Philadelphia, 1795 to 1798. This portrait was done by an artist by the name of Gilbert Stuart. Now, all of you maybe have never heard of Gilbert Stuart, but I can guarantee each and every single one of you has seen a Gilbert Stuart portrait before. And this is the reason. This is a Gilbert Stuart photograph. Otherwise spoken, back in the day, if you had your portrait done by Gilbert Stuart back in the day, that means you were pretty well known. Here we go. Here's the relatively new statue of Thomas Jefferson. It's in Paris on the left bank, right across the street from the Legion of Honor and the Musée d'Orsay. You can kind of see there in the lower right, that is the Louvre right there. And then that little footbridge that goes across the river from the left bank where we are. This is my own photograph. And that little footbridge goes over to the right bank, the Jardin des Tuileries. So here is an interesting example of Thomas Jefferson. I was there actually at the dedication of this statue representing the U.S. Embassy when I was a member of the political section there. But what's interesting about it, I mean, it's an excellent statue. I highly recommend it if you're traveling through Paris. Check it out. But also right across the street is the Legion of Honor. Volney was a commander in the Legion of Honor. So they were real close to each other. And indeed, here is a nice pen and ink of Volney wearing his little medallion as a commander of the Legion of Honor. And here is the statue of Benjamin Franklin, which is in Passy, I believe, pretty close to the Eiffel Tower. Well, in that section. It's on the, what is it? It's on the right bank, kind of close to the Palais de Chaillot, en fait. So there you go. It was Franklin that mentioned to the young Volney that if he wanted to broaden his horizons, that he should travel the world. Volney chose to travel to Syria and Egypt. So this was in the pre-French Revolution era, the early 1780s. Volney was in the Middle East, principally Syria and Egypt, a little bit in Cyprus. He learned the language, Arabic, and when he came back, he wrote his first book, which is still widely sought after today for its accuracy. It's called Travels Through Syria and Egypt. This book made Volney famous. It made him some money. And as a result, when it came time for the French Revolution, he was elected to the National Assembly. This is the famous tennis court oath. Volney is one of these guys over here. This is the Club Breton, a club, a group of deputies from the Brittany region that supported having a constitution based on the American model. That is, no king, no queen, separation of church and state, free trade, abolition of slavery. Of course, the Club Breton did not get those things. As it turned out, that first French constitution was a mixed constitution. It still had a king, still had royalty, but there was separation of church and state. That was helped along by Volney. So here, we're getting into the first theme of Volney's ruins. What causes empires to rise and fall? Is there a general principle that applies to everyone, all countries, all cultures, all continents, all centuries? According to Volney, empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish. And empires fall when the reverse occurs, when the government prevents its individuals, its citizenry from fully achieving each and every one their own talents, their own destiny, from living their life to the fullest. But if you have a nation that writes into its constitution freedom for the individual, and all of those strong individuals achieve their talents, become wealthy, dynamic, innovative, then the empire will rise. The country, the nation, the culture will thrive. Empires rise if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish. Everything depends upon how you define enlightened self-interest. We'll get into that later. But this image of the philosopher overlooking the ruins of Palmyra in modern-day Syria is what you will see with many editions of Volney's ruins. Many reprints in all languages typically have this image with the philosopher considering that exact question. Is there a general principle that describes the rise and fall of empires? Volney wrote this principle as an absolute refutation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. If you refute the social contract, you refute much of the theory of modern day socialism. And even though this book was published in 1791, thus many decades before Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and all the other communist books, Das Kapital, etc., Volney's Ruins also provides a prebuttal, a refutation in advance of Karl Marx's communism. So, Volney's book and his general principle explains why Russia, the USSR, failed, collapsed. Volney's book also explains, predicts, in effect, what's going to happen to the government of Communist China. So that was the first theme of Volney's Ruins. Here's the second theme, and this comes from an edition of the Jefferson translation published in Boston in the 1830s, and this is the back cover of that edition, and it deals with the second theme of Volney's Ruins, the General Assembly of Nations. And at this General Assembly of Nations, it's the last 4 chapters of the book. Volney brings together all the world's peoples, all the nations, all the cultures, all the languages, and everybody has a chance to stand up and speak their version of the truth, as seen from their own culture, from their own history, through their own eyes. Everyone has a chance to say their piece. This is like a modern day example of the United Nations. And at this General Assembly of Nations, written about by Volney, the second theme of his book, once everybody gives their own particular version of the truth, they get into a big fight, nothing is decided, and everybody camps on their own particular view of looking at the world. And into that situation comes a French philosopher who provides a solution to the world's enduring religious conflicts. So that's the second theme of Volney's Ruins, and indeed is the reason why Jefferson insisted that his translation be published anonymously, because he was being often accused of atheism by his political opponents. And he was worried that had it been known he was the translator of Volney's Ruins, it would put at risk his chance of winning the presidency in the election of 1800. So what is Volney's solution? Separation of church and state. He gets there in a very interesting way. I'm not going to recount that now. I'll do that in another video. But he provides a way to, let's say, help all the different parties involved, all the conflicting interests, all the conflicting religions, to realize that building this wall is the only way to achieve peace. Here's a copy of Volney's Ruins in French, published by Slot-Keen Reprints of Geneva and Paris, 1979. This orange cover, it's no longer in print, but it is a faithful reprint of the original 1791 edition. You can still find it on the internet. It's paperback, but it's high quality, so I recommend it. Here's a 1950 hardback copy of the Jefferson translation of Volney's Ruins. You will find it quite often today on the internet. If you can find a copy for less than $75 here in the spring of 2025, you're doing pretty good. High quality. It's that red cover. There's no other like it. You will be getting a Jefferson translation, and you do need to be careful because there are non-Jefferson English translations out there. Here's another paperback edition. This is from the early 1990s by the Black Classic Press. They reprinted the Jefferson translation. They did not mention that Jefferson translated it. They apparently did not know that themselves, but the Black Classic Press produced this 1990 paperback of the Jefferson translation, largely because Volney was in favor of abolition of slavery, and if you read Ruins very closely, you can see that the entire book is in favor of the liberty for all human beings. Here is a new reprint series by, Forgotten Books. And I've got this one myself. It's fairly large print, so I recommend this one. If you're just looking to buy, I guess it's around $20 plus shipping, of the Jefferson translation. Anytime you see this phrase, made under the inspection of the author being Volney himself, he had learned to speak English while he was in the United States. So this translation is the Jefferson translation. It says a new translation of Volney's Ruins. And if you see this phrase, made under the inspection of the author, you know it's the Jefferson translation. They don't mention that here either. Again, if only by default, nobody's paying attention. But I have become the world's leading authority on this issue. And indeed, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, I amassed even, shall we say, the world's largest collection of Jefferson translations, just buying them silently up on the internet, keeping my mouth closed while I was working in the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Paris and writing English Turn. Yeah, that was what I was doing. I'll let you know here in a little bit what I did with that world's largest collection. We'll talk about that here. But anyway, if you're looking for it, to be sure, if you buy a copy of this Forgotten Books or any edition that says made under the inspection of the author, you are for sure buying a Thomas Jefferson translation. So, sorry, this is a little bit out of focus, but this is the spine of the book that revealed the conspiracy between Thomas Jefferson and Volney. His name was Gilbert Chenard. He was a French researcher working at UVA and I believe some at Yale back in the 1920s. And he came across letters between Jefferson and Volney that strongly implied that Jefferson was the translator of the first 19 or 20 chapters of the 24-chapter Ruins of Empires book. Here's the title page. You can see right down here, 1925. Jefferson et les idéologues, right? Sa correspondance unpublished with Destitut de Tracy. He's the man who invented the word ideology. Cabanis was the medical doctor. J.B. Say was a French economist, kind of the French version of Adam Smith. And Auguste Comte was kind of a late-coming member of the ideologues, of which Volney was one. And so here's Gilbert Chenard. He's publishing this book in 1925 in the Johns Hopkins Press, Baltimore, Maryland, and in the Presse Universitaire of Paris, right there. And in this same book, you will find Volney et l'Amérique. And it's here in this Volney et l'Amérique where she now publishes the letters between Volney and Jefferson, which strongly imply, but do not absolutely prove that Jefferson was the translator of the Invocation plus the first, let's say, 20 chapters of the 24-chapter book. And as I mentioned before, right, this guy, you all recognize him, Karl Marx. Volney and his work represent an absolute refutation of communism. How? Why? How does he do that? Volney says in his follow-on book, To Ruins of Empires, it's called The Law of Nature. There's a chapter where he says, what is the foundation of the morality of private property? Why is private property moral? Volney says, in Law of Nature, the foundation of the morality of private property comes from the fact that every single human owns their own body. I own my body, you own yours, and no one has the right to put me in chains, to place me in slavery. And I believe the same is true for you. So what's the big problem for communism? They say there is no private property, that property is communal, owned by everyone. That's the same thing as saying there is no right of the individual. And if you look at the results, the facts, the history of communism, every time it's been tried, it's always failed. And Volney says, here is the reason why. Communism transgresses the natural law. People are born with the desire to live free. And any human institution, be it a government or a religion or a system of economics, that prevents the individual from living their lives to the greatest extent possible, that system is destined to fail. So, here we are at Monticello. Next time you visit, you walk in this front door here, right there. You're taking the standard tour. You walk in that front door. First thing you're going to see on the mantle above the fireplace is this pyramid. It's a gift from Volney. He gave it to Jefferson. And you take that tour. Be sure to ask the tour guide who provided that pyramid. It comes from Volney, but just see if you can stump the tour guide. Volney, while he was in the U.S., he was also inducted into the American Philosophical Society. This is where the building still stands in Philadelphia today. Volney was inducted by the president of the American Philosophical Society, none other than, who else? Thomas Jefferson. And you can see in their minutes, I've researched this myself, in the minutes you can see the sessions where Volney and Jefferson were together. So this provides more opportunity during those 3 brief years that Volney was in the United States. He not only visited Monticello, Volney and Jefferson were also meeting several times in Philadelphia at the American Philosophical Society. As it turned out, Volney was supposed to connect with politicians in the U.S., learn about what was going on in the United States, and then travel down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers all the way to New Orleans, investigating the possibility of France reacquiring Louisiana territory from the Crown of Madrid, from Spain. As it turns out, he took that canoe trip down the Ohio, but as he was doing that, he learned that the governor of the Spanish territory of Louisiana, based in New Orleans, knew he was coming, heard that he was on his way, and Volney was going to be arrested and thrown into prison, probably in Cuba, for the rest of his life. So Volney never did make it to New Orleans, but he came back to Philadelphia by way of New York. In New York, he met with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. As I said, everybody knew Volney, and Volney knew many people. He went back to the East Coast after his visit through the Ohio Valley. He goes back to the East Coast. And there he's sending back messages to the French government recommending against the French efforts to reacquire Louisiana from Spain. Here, by the way, is the original Louisiana. This is what most Americans think of as the original Louisiana. It's essentially all the right bank of the Mississippi River, all the way up into even parts of Canada, parts of North Texas, all the way into Wyoming and Montana. That's what we think of, Americans, as Louisiana. But the original Louisiana, before the United States was even born, this was the original Louisiana. It was both banks, left bank and right bank of the Mississippi River, plus all tributaries, left bank and right bank, from the mouth of the rivers and tributaries to their headwaters. This was the original Louisiana, and it was huge. And then when the French lost what the Americans call the French and Indian War, what the Europeans call the 7 Years' War, when the French lost that war, they lost the entirety of Louisiana. This left bank right here, this went to the English crown, the right bank went to the Spanish crown, and all of Canada went to the English crown as well. But this was the original Louisiana. Gives you an idea what Bonaparte gave up when he sold in 1803 Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson. He held it in his hands. Bonaparte held right bank, River Mississippi, Louisiana in his hands for 3 years. And partly under the influence of Volney, decided to sell it, full well knowing what he was giving up. He was giving up the future. He knew that. How did he know that? Volney told him. But Volney also told him, from Volney's trip down the Ohio River, he discovered wherever the French settlers were in competition against the Anglo-Saxon settlers, the French settlers always lost, were always impoverished. While the Anglo-Saxons were working hard in their fields, improving their lands, the French were out chasing Indian girls or hunting for fur in the forests, allowing their farms and homesteads to go to ruin. That's what Volney told Bonaparte when Bonaparte was making the decision. And that's part of the reason why Bonaparte decided to sell. And here's a tableau of that signature in Paris, the signature of Louisiana. And this influence of Volney, even among Louisiana specialists, is really not very well known. Volney's kind of behind the scenes role in helping to convince Bonaparte to sell Louisiana to the Americans. So now let's talk about Volney and his ruins, the influence of that book upon artists and writers. Here is an example. Many of you have probably seen this famous tableau by the American artist Thomas Cole. It's in Wikipedia. Thomas Cole, the head of the Hudson River Valley School. He did a series of 5 tableaux regarding the course of empires. He was, Cole, influenced by his reading of Volney's Ruins, most probably the Thomas Jefferson translation. This was done in the 1820s and 30s. There's a series of 5. Here's the one that describes the revolution, the end of the empire. You see the headless soldier and all the chaos that's going amid the storm as the empire falls into dissolution. So here is one example of Volney's Ruins of Empires' influence in the world of art. Let's talk about the writers. Lord Byron, William Blake, Mary Shelley, Stendhal, Victor Hugo, Balzac all mentioned their influence by Volney's Ruins. Let's talk specifically just about 2 of them here, Mary Shelley and Balzac. Next time you read a first edition of Frankenstein, turn to page chapter 13. Chapter 13, the monster escapes into the mountains. He's being pursued by the villagers who want to destroy him, who want to kill him. The monster escapes into a small village up in the mountains, and it's there that the local villagers accept him. They protect him, they feed him, they teach him how to speak, read, and write. And what book do they use to teach the monster about human society? Of course, Volney's Ruins of Empires. Walt Whitman, his most famous book, Leaves of Grass, reads very much like Volney's Ruins. Next time you have a chance, read both books and you will see the similarities. And Whitman himself mentions growing up as a young man and having access to Volney's Ruins in the library of Walt Whitman's father. Frederick Douglass, the former slave and great abolitionist leader, also mentions Volney's Ruins and the importance of that book's arguments in favor of freedom for all human beings. And here is just a the frontispiece of an 1809 French edition of La Loi Naturelle, Natural Law, or Catéchisme du Citoyen Français, par Volney. You see, he was a member of the Senate Conservateur. He was a count in the empire. He was a commander in the Legion of Honor. He was a member of the Institute, seat number 24, and many other intellectual societies, born in 1757 in Craon, that's in the Anjou region, and he died in Paris in 1820. Here you see at the bottom, the original edition is 1793, so that's 2 years after the first edition of Ruins of Empires appeared. And today you'll find in many editions of Volney's Ruins, at the back, you will find Law of Nature, which was originally known as Catechisme of the French Citizen. Why that? Because in 1793, after Volney was out of the National Assembly, the current National Assembly asked him to write this book of morality, which was going to help teach the French people the moral basis of this new French Republic that they were not familiar with. They were familiar with Catholicism and medieval feudalism, and the Second National Assembly asked Volney to write a book which would provide with them, for the French people, an understanding of the modern Enlightenment-based moral principles upon which this new republic was founded. Balzac, the writer. Here's his statue in the Boulevard Raspail, there in the Montparnasse section of Paris. An interesting thing about Balzac was, before he became Balzac the writer, he was the owner of a small print shop. And in the 1830s, Volney's book, Ruins of Empires, was outlawed by the king. During the Restoration, Volney's Ruins was outlawed, but even so, in 1827, Balzac participated in the printing and distribution of a new edition of Volney's Ruins, 1827, and you can see it, if you ever see a French edition, 1827, on the internet, you will find inside the reference to Imprimerie de H. Balzac. So Balzac was influenced by Volney's Ruins and participated in the publishing of the book even during the time when it was outlawed during the Restoration. And then Alexis de Tocqueville, he mentions Volney and Volney's voyage down the Ohio Valley in Democracy in America. It's in the footnotes. If you have a copy of Democracy in America, look in the index and you will find, I believe, 2 footnotes talking about Volney's experiences meeting the French colonists in the Ohio Valley and how they were failing on their farms. At the same time, in the exact same areas, the Anglo-Saxon colonists were thriving. And why? In essence, Volney said, the French talk too much. They spend too much time talking, gossiping among neighbors, hunting and chasing Indian girls. And the result is, this is why France lost all of its colonies in North America, Canada, and Louisiana. The French talk too much. You can find that in the footnotes, Democracy in America. Here's another reference. God is Not Great, from Christopher Hitchens, the late great writer. He briefly mentions Thomas Jefferson's anonymous translation in this book, a very brief reference. He doesn't go into it at all, but in case any of you happen to have a copy of this book in your libraries, you can look up Volney. Let's talk about political figures. I said Volney knew everyone, and everyone knew Volney. Here's an example. George Washington. He knew who Volney was, and today, at Mount Vernon, in the library, you can find a copy of Volney's Ruins. And while Volney was in the U.S., 1795 to 98, he visited the retired George Washington at Mount Vernon. And at that time, Washington was not agreeing to receive everyone who requested a visit, but he did agree to receive Volney. Here's a replica of Mount Vernon. It's in the hills west of Paris in a little town called Vaucresson. It was built by one of the Dassault brothers, but it's an exact replica of Mount Vernon. I took this picture myself, and I just kind of like it. It gives an idea about the links between the two sister republics, France and the United States. Here's another politician who read Volney's ruins. You know this guy. Where does this story come from? It comes from here, Herndon's Lincoln. William Herndon was Lincoln's law partner and very first biographer after Lincoln's death. And in this book, Herndon's Lincoln, Herndon describes an incident when Lincoln was a young man living in New Salem. He was working at a general store as a clerk, kind of as a gopher. Didn't know what he was going to do with his life, but the owner of that general store was kind of like the center of the community, and he was a big reader, and he put Volney's ruins into the young Abraham Lincoln's hands. And immediately after, Lincoln wrote an essay about how there is no physical evidence proving the existence of Jesus Christ. There is no physical evidence from the era that shows Jesus Christ, the person, even existed. So Lincoln writes this essay. He hands it to the owner of that store. The owner of the store reads it and says, "Excellent essay, wonderful work, young man, but you have a political career ahead of you. And so you don't need the controversy that would come from people reading this essay, which might hurt your political career." And so the store owner put that essay into the fire, burned it. But that just gives you an idea of Lincoln's contact with Volney's ruins. Here's Rue Volney. It's in the 2nd arrondissement, close to the Opera. And here you see philosophe et homme politique, philosopher and politician. Here's his birth and death dates. Rue Volney is just about a couple of 100 meters long. Not very big, but it kind of connects, not directly, but indirectly, it connects the Opera with Place Vendôme. And here begins a little syndrome that I've noticed in all my years researching Volney in Paris, that wherever you find Volney, you will find Bonaparte very close by. And this is one example. Right here, close to Rue Volney, right next door, is indeed Place Vendôme. And here's Bonaparte on top of the pillar there. I call it Bonaparte on a stick. But right behind, this is the Ministry of Justice right there. And right behind the Ministry of Justice, you will find Rue Volney. So this is the first time you see the two guys close together. Here's another example. This is the Geneviève Library in the 5th arrondissement of Paris. It's on Place Panthéon, the Pantheon. And if you'll notice right here, there are all these panels right here contain the names of important philosophers and writers and scientists dating back to, I guess, Egypt, all the way through the Egyptians, the Romans, the Renaissance era, and then you go right around the corner And on this little panel right there, what you'll find is Volney and Napoleon marked right there again, right next to each other. Here is inside the Court of Honor at the Institute, Left Bank, Paris, the political section where I was then working as an analyst and writer was fortunate to have an invitation to have a professional tour here of the Institute, the National Academy, l'Académie Nationale, l'Académie Française. And Volney was what, seat 24, right? And so here you see members of my political section. It was not my political section, but of which I was a member. And they're all going here through this doorway into the big coupole, the big domed room where the members of the Académie Française hold their big meetings. We had been on essentially an hour tour, and I'd had everyone, all my colleagues, all my friends here. I'd had everybody. I said, Volney is a member of the Academy. Let's check out every room. Let's find, there's got to be a portrait. There's got to be a statue. There's got to be some sort of evidence that Volney was a member of the Institute. And so I had everybody in the political section during that entire hour-long guided tour. And I asked the tour guide, do you know Volney? And this professional tour guide had never heard of Volney. Never heard that he'd been on the National Assembly, that he had co-written the first French Constitution, that his #1 book had been translated by Thomas Jefferson. This tour guide had never heard any of that. But this tour guide gamely took us on the standard tour and participated as all the members of the political section were looking at all the portraits, all the stels, all the statues, and we did not find Volney. And toward the end of it, all these people, they were my colleagues, they were my friends, they were looking at me like, what's the matter with you, boy? We think you're getting a little bit too carried away with this thing here, right? They were kind of looking at me out of the corners of their eye, and here we are at the very end of the tour, just going in toward the coupole so we can see the domed room where they have their big meetings when they're wearing those big costumes and everything, le grand costume. We're going up through here, and I was really feeling quite defeated myself, and I took this picture right here, and there was just this one stele right here, and then this one statue over here, and they were the last things that we were going to see. So I took this picture and then followed my colleagues in, and what did I discover right there? That's the stele of Volney in the Court of Honor at the Académie Française. This is a picture of me actually when I was somewhat younger, had actual color to my hair. That's the stele by David, 1828, I believe. Quite marble, quite massive. It's a wonderful stele and is well done. And it was kind of like a little bit of justification for me. I certainly felt good at this. And then someone in the entourage of my political section friends suggested that this picture be taken because they said I had a similar profile to Volney, and you can judge that for yourself. Go right inside, on the way to the coupole, and what have you but a statue of Bonaparte. So again, here it is. Wherever you find Volney in Paris, very close by, you will find Bonaparte. Speaking of Bonaparte, right? Here's a young Bonaparte. Volney discovered Bonaparte on the island of Corsica in 1793. Volney was famous. Bonaparte was a nobody, just a member of the local militia. But he knew who Volney was, a hero of the French Revolution, participated in the writing of the first French Constitution, the author of several books. And Bonaparte started guiding Volney around the island. They became friends of a sort. And later, they were both forced to flee the island when the British took over and put in place Bonaparte's enemy, a guy by the name of Paoli, kind of a strong man. And Paoli was the allies of the British and forced all of the people who favored Corsica's links to France and favored particularly Republican style government as opposed to royalist kings and so forth. So both Volney and Bonaparte had to flee the island. And then later, that same year, 1793, a young Bonaparte, now a general in the French army, he's here in Nice with Volney right here in the center, and a general, a kind of a no-name general, a little bit overweight kind of a guy. But here is a portrait of the young Bonaparte before he leaves on his famous campaign in Italy. He's describing to his dinner guests how he's going to maintain, how he's going to take Italy, giving them all the details at this little dinner. And then later, when both Bonaparte and Volney were back in Paris, a few years later, Volney participated in the coup d'etat that brought Bonaparte to power. And as thanks, Bonaparte even offered the third consulship to Volney. Bonaparte was first consul. You see him there in the middle. The second and third consuls flanking him on each side. That could have been Volney, one of those two, but Volney declined. Bonaparte offered for Volney to become interior minister. Volney declined. He said, yeah, I will become a member of your Senate, and I will act as an informal advisor to you on, let's say, New World issues. And this is how it came to be that Volney was advising Bonaparte about the sale of Louisiana. Then, of course, 1804 arrives. The Republican mask falls, and Bonaparte reveals he wants to become Napoleon and establish a hereditary empire. Volney was one of 3 senators to vote against the proclamation of the empire, even though he had long been a counselor to Bonaparte, and even though Bonaparte, as a young man, had admired Volney, Volney remained loyal to the principles of 1789, that original French Constitution, which brought an end to church involvement and full powers for the royalty. Volney saw that the mask had fallen and that Bonaparte was really out to place his own family upon the French throne. And that's why Volney voted against the proclamation of the empire. So here's the pyramid in Père Lachaise. This is where Volney is buried. It's up on top of the hill. It's not on that little tourist map that they give. So it's kind of hard to find. It's up in an area. Even I've been to the office there at Père Lachaise saying, do you know where the Volney tomb is? And they don't know. They kind of give you an area where it is. But this is what it looks like. It's a genuine rendition, replica of a Egyptian pyramid. So if you happen to be in Père Lachaise, it's higher up on the hill than Morrison, right? But it's kind of hidden. I can get there without the map, of course, but it's not easy to do. So here we are, back at the beginning. Volney's Ruins of Empires. Empires rise, if government allows enlightened self-interest to flourish. And as a bonus, the book also provides a solution to the world's enduring religious conflicts. The book was popular in the U.S. all the way through the 19th century, really up until about the 1920s. It was republished. This unknown Jefferson translation was republished many times throughout the 19th century. Irony of ironies. Everybody used to read the book, but nobody knew Thomas Jefferson translated it. Today, I can prove Thomas Jefferson translated it, but no one is reading Volney's Ruins. Here's the front cover of my favorite edition of the Jefferson translation. If you can find this for less than $500, a good condition, oh boy, you're doing pretty good. This is published in Boston by Charles Gaylord in the 1830s and 1840s. You'll see the classic philosopher overlooking the ruins of Palmyra. And then on the back cover, this is the only edition anywhere in the world in any language that gets the second theme correct. Whoever this Charles Gaylord person was, he commissioned this little pen and ink showing the General Assembly of Nations, where Volney provides the solution to the world's enduring religious conflicts. This is the only edition. This Charles Gaylord of Boston, 1830s, 1840s, translated by Jefferson. It's the only edition that gets both themes of the book correct. The political science theme and the General Assembly of Nations theme. And here we come back to my novel. Notice what I've done. Here's Bonaparte overlooking these ruins. And indeed, Volume 1 is called Ruins of Empires. Napoleon Invades Louisiana. So what have I done? I've just taken the same idea, someone overlooking the ruins, and replace the philosopher with Bonaparte. As I said before, I'm currently writing Volume 2. It's going to be called Rule Over Ashes. English turn, Rule Over Ashes. Napoleon invades the United States. And here's the guy I have to thank for the original idea. He's the French politician, Jacques Chirac, who provoked me into conceiving those three little words. I had no idea who Volney was. I'd never heard of Ruins of Empires. But this guy, Jacques Chirac, tried to outlaw use of the English language in France. And that's when I said to myself, hey, Jack, it's too late, man. English, at the end of World War II, it had become the world's lingua franca du monde. It used to be French, yes, but now, today, post-World War II, it's English. English is the language of business, of art, of people who travel around the world. No matter where you're going, it helps to be able to speak English. English is the language of the internet. But Jack was trying to outlaw use of the English language in France. Come on, Jack. If you really wanted that to happen, Bonaparte should not have sold Thomas Jefferson, should not have sold Louisiana to Thomas Jefferson. He should have gotten on a boat, sailed to New Orleans, planted the French flag at the mouth of the Mississippi River, and claimed all of Louisiana territory for the glory of the French Republic. And there is where he would have crowned himself emperor. Whoa. That's a great idea for a novel. That's how I thought of it. Right there. That's how I thought of those 3 words. Napoleon invades Louisiana. It was in the latter part of the 1990s. Even before I was working at the embassy, I thought of those 3 words. Now I'm working on volume 2. Here, by the way, is from whence comes the title, English Turn. This is the Mississippi River. It makes this big turn down here. New Orleans is right about there at the top of this like big question mark you see right there. New Orleans is about right there. And this turn in the river today is called the English Turn. But originally in 1699, it was called Detour Anglois. Anglois being Old French for Anglais, just like Francois is Old French for Français. Detour Anglois. It comes from a 1699 event. I recount that event in my novel, English Turn. I'm not going to get into it now, but if you want to learn about it, it's in the novel. It's also on the internet. Yeah, Volume 2, Napoleon invades Louisiana, right? Or Napoleon invades the United States. How is he going to do that? How do you go from New Orleans down here near the mouth of the Mississippi all the way to Washington, D.C.? Well, you take this little thing called the Natchez Trace. And as you go along, you free the slaves, right? That's how Bonaparte is going to invade the United States. He's going to follow the Natchez Trace, and he's going to free the slaves as he goes, creating a freed slave black army. Kind of like how Sherman crossed the South toward the end of the Civil War. That's what Bonaparte is doing here. What's Bonaparte's problem? Bonaparte's problem is that there's some 5 million Americans and only about 50,000 French living in Louisiana. There's no way that Bonaparte is ever going to be able to outfight the Americans unless he does something unexpected. That's why he invades the United States, and I have him going all the way to Monticello, on the outskirts of Washington City. What am I using as metaphor? What am I using as inspiration for English Turn 2, Napoleon invades the United States? This. This is what's happening in the U.S. right now. And it's my goal to create a metaphor with English Turn 2 reflecting this, the reemergence of a conspiracy between church and state. And this guy and all of his friends are providing me with my material. Thanks, guys. And unfortunately, we've got now Trump 2.0. I voted against him 3 times, and I'm a former Republican. Might I parenthetically add, I used to vote Republican ever since Reagan. But this is just too much. The Republican Party has now been taken over by a clique of oligarchs and religious fanatics. And unfortunately, the majority of people voted for it. And well, we are where we are. So, my friends, That's the importance of Volney's ruins. This is where we're headed. We can still stop it from happening. It's not too late. But people need to have a reminder about the Enlightenment-based principles upon which the United States was founded. You can find that in Thomas Jefferson's anonymous translation of Volney's Ruins. Here's my second novel, Kachu, White House. It's about the collapse of that great civilization in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. Here is one of the meeting rooms where you see there's this little room back here, and then there's a trench. And so this is chapter 1 of Kachu. A man dressed in a costume comes up from this trench and goes around frightening all of the local tribes, all of the simple people. He's a god. He's a ghost. He's a Gomeo-ish in the using the word of the local tribes, directly from the origin myth of Acoma. A Gomeo-ish arises from this trench, but it's only a man in a costume frightening the simple families and maintaining the elite's control of the people. Here's the Four Corners region. Right here is where you will find Chaco Canyon. Here is the major palace. Today it's called Casa Bonita, the beautiful house. But the interesting thing about this civilization in the Four Corners was each palace was built in alignment with the sun or the moon or some of the planets. So like this main wall you see right here is exactly east-west, so that on the two equinoxes, in the spring and fall, the sun rises and sets in alignment with this wall. So this palace, which in my novel I call the Sun God Palace, today it's called Casa Bonita, it was actually a marker, which was a method of attracting the local tribes to come to the canyon where it's dry and it's almost impossible to grow food. And this elite families lived in their palaces, and they lived off the offerings brought to them by the surrounding tribes. Because why? Well, the elite, using their knowledge of the rising and setting of the suns and the moons, they were able to control the local tribes, and the local tribes brought them offerings. Here's Casa Bonita today, the ruins. You can still see the main wall right there. Here's another view of Casa Bonita. And one of the things that shows that this was a stratified society was, you see this little arroyo that goes right down the center of this canyon, Chaco Canyon. On this side of the arroyo, this is the right bank of the arroyo, there are only palaces. And on the other bank, the left bank, there are all much smaller buildings, nowhere near as grandiose, nowhere near as well built as the palaces on this side. This is where the commoners lived. They're called ordinaries in my story. And on top of this butte, here at the mouth of Chaco Canyon, right there, it's right about there, there are 3 slabs of stone. Here they are. And on the summer and winter solstices, sunlight comes down through the gaps in these slabs of stone and creates light patterns on a spiral which is etched into the butte itself. Here's the summer sun coming down through, and it creates the summer solstice, this dagger of light. It's called the sun dagger by the artist. Anasophera, who discovered this phenomenon. She called it the sun dagger. She was on top of the butte near the summer solstice one day near noon and discovered this phenomenon. The light dagger was just a little bit off to one side. She came back on the solstice. This is in the late 1970s she discovered this, Anasophera. And then that changed her life. She still continues her work today, discovering other things related to the elites' palaces and their alignments with the sun and the moon. Spring and fall equinox. Here's the spring equinox. And on the fall equinox, the dagger of light is here, and there's a small dagger of light over on this little spiral. And then at the winter solstice, when the sun is down lower, it goes through two separate slabs, and it creates two slabs of two daggers of light on the outside tangents of this spiral. Here's an actual picture of the sun dagger going through the center of the spiral on the summer solstice, and you can also see here the gaps in the slabs of stone. This effect, by the way, no longer happens. One of the slabs moved for whatever reason, and so they haven't fixed it yet. I don't know if they're ever going to fix it, but they did document it happening over several years before sometime, I believe, in the 1980s or 90s. One of the slabs moved, and this effect no longer happens. Here's the winter solstice with the two daggers of light coming through the two separate gaps. And then here's an added incredible effect, and that this is the light of the moon, the full moon. The moon makes 18.6 year cycle moving north and south along the horizon, just like the sun does on an annual basis. The sun moves toward the north in the summer, toward the south in the winter. The moon makes the same trek across the horizon, north to middle, and then back down south, and then back to the middle, and then up to the northern extreme again. It does the same type of journey that the sun does, but it takes 18.6 years for the moon to do this. And when the moon reaches its maximum extreme, it puts this light of the moon right down the center of the same spiral and puts the other half of the spiral in shadow. So this is one of the few markers on the planet that combine in a single marker the annual cycle of the sun and that multi-annual cycle of the moon. It's quite stunning. In effect, my friends, Chaco Canyon is the American Stonehenge, and not many people know about it. And here you see how this happens. Here's the equinox of the sun directly east and west. Here's the summer solstice to the north. Here's the winter solstice toward the south. This is where we rise. This is where we set down here on the bottom. And then here are the northern lunar minimums and northern lunar maximums. So this is how the moon moves toward a minimum and then a maximum. It's a little more complex than the sun, the movements of the sun. I won't get into that now, but this just gives you an idea of what it looks like on the horizon. Here is Chaco Canyon with its network of roads. So this was an empire. This was an empire, and understanding Volney's Ruins of Empires helped me to take the local legends and the origin myth of Acoma and combine them with my knowledge of why empires rise and fall from Volney's ruins, and that's how I was able to write Kash, Kachu. Here is an example of an outlier of Chaco Canyon where the full moon is rising between two natural pillars of stone in Colorado. And this is it's marking the northernmost lunar maximum. Only happens once every 18.6 years. And you see the Chacoans built right here a little palace to venerate the rising of the full moon between these two natural pillars exactly in this spot. And here is New York, right? This happens in New York with every equinox or around the equinoxes. There are some streets that run east-west, and they call it, I believe, Manhattan Hinge. So there we go. That's the end of my presentation. I'm Thomas Christian Williams. I'm a writer. I write historical fiction novels. My job as a writer is to take people to places they've never been. So I hope I've done that for you today. You've learned about Volney's ruins, why Thomas Jefferson translated it, how other artists were inspired, writers, politicians, painters, inspired by Volney's ruins, how it applies to what's going on the planet right here, right now, today, how I have used my understanding of Volney's ruins to write 2 historical fiction novels, both of which are available on Amazon, English Turn and Kachu. I'm Thomas Christian Williams. Thanks for sticking around. We got kind of a long video going here, so I appreciate your time. Give my channel a follow, and if you would like to contribute to this work, please consider buying one of my novels. And I give speeches. I give speeches in French and in English on Volney's ruins. So, talk to your local committee or your local organization. Have me invited either live, or we can do some speeches via Zoom, of course. So thanks for your attention, and hope to hear from you soon. I invite all questions in the comments. Thank you. Bye.